Good evening. The proper thing is to say good evening back. I am so happy to see all of you here, and we're going to get started on time. Well, at my age, I'm happy to be any place. You can read all of this about Paul. I want to just say a few things that's not on here. When Paul came to interview me, he brought back memories that I had wished were lost forever. And when he brought me back the transcript of what he was going to report, I said, Paul, if you put that in there and say, I said it, I'll be out of a job. Now, I don't want you to lie, but you don't have to tell all of the truth. And so it was a pleasure actually being interviewed by Paul for his book, Unfinished Business, Social Action in Suburbia, Long Island, 1945 to 2014. We have a rich history, and I'm certainly hopeful that all of you will get the book and read it. It is spellbinding, and if you lived in that era, it will bring back memories, too, that you wish you had forgotten. However, we've brought us to this point, and I want to thank Paul for laboring so long, so hard to make all of this possible. And as you know, Paul has many, many firsts. And one of the ones that is so important to me is the first with his establishing an organization for youth, and the second thing, the Intergenerational Center. We can't have too much of that. It's really good for young people, it's good for middle-aged people, and it's good for the ones of us who are mature people. And I am so happy to know Paul and to know that he's done this great work, and I'm sure we're waiting to hear what he has to say. I introduce to you Paul Arfin.
Thank you. Hi. Right, that's my wife's recommendation. If you didn't get one of these, there's some on the counter. It tells a little bit about the book. Good afternoon, and thanks for being here. I'd first like to thank Norm Goodman, who's the SUNY Distinguished Teaching Professor and Distinguished Service Professor, for inviting me to speak today. I'd also like to thank Charles Robbins, who's not here. He's the Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education and Dean of the Undergraduate Colleges, for the invitation. I got to know Norm about 45 years ago when I was a youth center director in Huntington, while he was serving as vice chairman and member of the newly formed Suffolk County Youth Board, where he provided much counsel to the fledgling county agency. My lecture today is based on the book I wrote earlier this year, Unfinished Business, Social Action in Suburbia, Long Island, New York, 1945-2014. So that's about 55, about almost 70 years. But I mainly concentrated on 1945 to 1985. And even within that, I focused on 1960 to 1985, where most of the things that I'm going to talk about happened. But before I do, I'd also want to acknowledge the presence of a number of people, some whose names I have here, and some that I may omit because I don't know you. But some of the folks that are here are Miriam and Jameer Couch, whose father, Jim Couch, was a very important figure in the development of anti-poverty programs and fighting for civil rights and health care. Marvin Colson is here from the School of Social Welfare. Was very involved with developmental disabilities. Richard Dina from the Family Service Association and many other. Renee Feichter, he's not here yet. He's a DA, and he was instrumental in getting EAC Inc. started way back when. Carl Grossman, a an award-winning journalist, over 50 years, and if anybody knows the politics of Long Island, it's Carl. Nancy Marr, one of the best community organizers that I've ever met. Lillian McCormick, here, Lillian in the front aisle, was a very important figure that I'll talk about. And Diana O'Neill is not here yet. She's the head of the Long Island Volunteer Center. And Tom Williams. Tom started the Brookhaven Youth Board, was the head of Cornell Cooperative Extension in Suffolk County, director of Suffolk Community Council, many things, both with titles and below the radar. A few words, maybe I'm not going to bother with this. I'll just say that I've been a social worker, community organizer, CEO for nonprofits here on Long Island since 1966, after serving in the Peace Corps in Colombia during the early days. I was in Colombia when JFK was assassinated. After the Peace Corps, I worked for 13 years as a youth center director in Huntington and a YMCA executive, where I established its family services division. Afterwards, I founded an organization that operated intergenerational daycare centers. We had 3 large intergenerational daycare centers. And I served for 22 years with that organization. And then in 2002, at my traditional retirement, I launched several nonprofit initiatives and got involved with some boards of directors and wrote numerous published articles on social issues. So, at the end of 2014, I read The Bully Pulpit, almost a year ago, the book about Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and the Golden Age of Journalism by Doris Kearns Goodwin. I was particularly struck by the description of the progressive era during the late 19th and 20th centuries of national initiatives to check corporate power and address social issues. I'd also recently read books about social reformers like Jane Addams, Eleanor Roosevelt, and Frances Perkins. It struck me that stories about social change at the national level were written, but not about local efforts like Long Island. I felt that the work done by Long Islanders after World War II was substantial and should be recorded in one place. Some people thought that the book wasn't necessary. We have the internet and we have libraries, but I felt strongly that a book of this nature needed to be written. I was inspired to record this history and decided to write the book. I didn't know my research would reveal the amount of significant social policy and program accomplishments I'd find. I'm going to tell you about them. When the mass of city dwellers arrived on Long Island in the late 40s and 50s, Long Island was primarily rural, with small hamlets and an agricultural economy with no county legislatures. Post-World War II, Long Island changed dramatically as the troops returned to find jobs and housing and raise their families. The GI Bill enabled many to afford college educations. Long Island's large defense industry provided jobs, while access to nearby New York City on the new Long Island Expressway and the parkways and the Long Island Railroad provided access to city employment. This was a period in both counties guided by a philosophy of local control and zoning policies that assured that racial minorities were housed in segregated communities. It was also a period of considerable political corruption and unscrupulous land deals. Not all of the new suburbanites could afford a middle-class lifestyle. If you were white and poor, you could buy a home according to your ability to afford a mortgage. If you were black, your housing choices were extremely limited. The ultimate manifestation of this racism occurred in Levittown, often regarded as America's first planned suburban community. There, African Americans couldn't purchase homes, regardless of their income or military service. Brokers were prohibited from selling to blacks. In terms of social programs, there were few nonprofit service organizations. Those that existed were principally sponsored by religious organizations aiding the physically or mentally disabled and destitute children. Just a few proprietary hospitals operated in both counties, providing limited health care for the indigent. There were no public hospitals or outpatient services, mental health centers, youth or senior centers, daycare centers, or group homes for people with disabilities or mental illnesses. The only school of social work was located at Delphi College, where I graduated in 1962, and later got an MSW in 1970. With respect to public financial assistance and services for the needy, the 13 towns had welfare offices that made decisions about residents' eligibility for the home relief program, while the county administered the Aid to the Dependent Children program. It was suspected that town welfare workers doled out funds based on political considerations, as so many decisions were done. In writing the book, my goals were fourfold: to document Long Island's social action and social service history, to acknowledge the substantial work of nonprofit leaders and pioneers, to inspire, and I guess I'm just especially thankful that we have some people under the age of 25 here today, based on impressions, because I hope this may inspire you. That some of us were like your age when this stuff happened. To inspire current and future generations to continue the struggle for social justice and social welfare services. And lastly, to identify lessons learned to guide current and future leaders. I conducted 50 face-to-face interviews with lay volunteers and professional social welfare and social action leaders, journalists like Carl and Bob Keeler from Newsday, and politicians. Some of them were well into their 80s and 90s. I also reviewed hundreds of published news articles, mainly in Newsday's online archives, and they're included, many of them are included in the book. Many of the interviewed lay volunteers lived during the 1930s and experienced the positive impact that the federal government had in lifting the country out of the Great Depression and winning World War II. They saw government as a positive force. They were optimists about America's future and confident that social problems could be solved. The interviewed leaders had several motivations for their community activities. Many had socially progressive views for the time. Others were involved due to their religious convictions, while still others were mainly concerned about good government or making Long Island a greater place to live and raise a family. Some were motivated by personal experience with illness or disability, and so they got involved with the disability organizations, etc. The common theme, the takeaway is they demonstrated considerable determination and perseverance in the face of public and political resistance towards tax-supported services. The interviewed social welfare and social justice pioneers now look back fondly on the 60s and 70s, recalling inspirational national leaders like John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, Gloria Steinem, Cesar Chavez, Shirley Chisholm, Allard Lowenstein, Ralph Nader, Bella Abzug, as well as presidential initiatives and congressional actions that created major social welfare advancements, including Medicare, Medicaid, and the Voting Rights Act, and much more. Locally, role models also existed. Andy Kazaza, Sal Ambrosino, Ken Anderson, Ann Mead, Marty Timon, Joyce and Burghardt Turner, and many, many others. Interviewees considered these times as a renaissance period of purpose, of meaning, innovation, and creativity. As the state closed 2 of the 3 Long Island institutions for the mentally ill and sharply downsized the 3rd, advocates insisted that the former patients be provided with community-based services. Nevertheless, thousands of patients were discharged under the influence of powerful medications to the streets of Long Beach, Bayshore, and Sayville. To address poverty, community advocates and civil rights leaders developed the Federal War on Poverty. Despite considerable resistance to acknowledge the existence of poverty in Andy Hardeesville, Long Island. Leaders of the Economic Opportunity Council, such as John Kearse in Nassau County and Joyce and Burghardt Turner and Ralph Watkins in Suffolk County, fought racism while developing job and training programs and health centers. Much of the racial conflict had economic roots. Real estate brokers exacerbated racism for personal gain. Brokers profited from the fears of white residents who opposed the concept that racially integrated schools against racially integrated schools. Efforts to expose discrimination against black teacher candidates were part of a larger struggle against job discrimination. When Lincoln Lynch, the director of the Nassau County chapter of the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, targeted the Franklin National Bank, now defunct, for its failure to hire minority group employees, he was charged with forcing companies to hire employees based on their race. A Newsday editorial accused Lynch of, quote, sowing the seeds of disunity, unquote, and provoked an exchange of letters involving Lynch and other community activists. Despite these criticisms, CORE's activism successfully forced companies to end discriminatory hiring practices. 4 years later, CORE led a campaign to integrate the all-white Hempstead Volunteer Fire Department. While the leading proponents of Long Island's civil rights movement were CORE and the NAACP, faith-based institutions either acting independently or in coalitions played a major role in the struggle. The failure to create stable, racially integrated communities resulted in today's checkerboard pattern of racial segregation and unequal school funding. Throughout this period, civil rights groups pressured businesses and school districts to hire blacks. CORE campaigns against job discrimination set off sharp conflict and stirred up opposition in the white community. In addition, many black residents felt that police were more inclined to harass than protect them, and actions by white officials were often frustrated young blacks and incited some rioting in some Nassau and Suffolk communities. The social pioneers' stories address challenges from both charitable and philanthropic perspectives. The difference being, as defined by Benjamin Sokas in his article in the Chronicle of Philanthropy, that philanthropy addresses causes, while charity addresses palliatives and sentimental impulses. The article suggests that both charity and philanthropy seek a fairer distribution of essential survival resources, but in different ways. It also suggests that the imperatives of charity and philanthropy can both guide a single institution. Within this conceptual framework, my research shows that Long Islanders involved in social welfare conducted both charitable and philanthropic work. Some of the lay volunteers were not only concerned about Long Island's future, they are also people of means. They established charitable foundations to support the development of social agencies and social justice organizations. Of particular note are the VEACH program of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation at Shelter Rock, the Long Island Community Foundation, the Harry Chapin Foundation, and the Diocese of Rockville Center's Campaign for Human Development. Many other smaller foundations were also established, mostly through support to local hospitals and educational institutions, directing very little money to your new youth centers and daycare centers and elder centers, etc. Some people directed their charitable giving through the United Way, which got established in the late 1950s. The social welfare professionals portrayed in the book were often a generation younger than the lay people who formed the nonprofit organizations. These master's degree holding professionals were part of a generation with a strong sense of personal responsibility that wanted to be directly involved in addressing social problems. They had little concern for their personal aggrandizement nor job security. They urged elected officials to fund social welfare programs on an ongoing basis rather than annually. Annual fundraising caused much uncertainty for nonprofits about their future and to spend inordinate amounts of time justifying their existence by conducting what I call begathons before elected officials every year. Public officials were urged to implement decentralized services and include nonprofit consumers and professionals as members of community advisory boards, task forces, and committees. We wanted meaningful community participation, one of the basic concepts of the war on poverty. Of particular note in Suffolk County were the efforts of community people like John Foley, Priscilla Redfield Rowe, whose daughter is here today, I didn't acknowledge you before, and Marilyn Schellebarger to convince Suffolk County to establish community-based health centers rather than a medical center, centralized medical center like in Nassau County. Nassau County also had its strong social advocates, including Salvatore Ambrosino, Richard Dina, Sadie Hofstein, Ann Irvin, David Cadane, John Kearse, Lilo and Marvin Leeds, Lillian McCormick, Marge Rogatz, Joan Saltzman, and Rick Van Dyke, and many others. This is one of the risks in writing a book about heroes. You know, you're not going to get all of them. When a health system planning agency was established by the federal government, advocates like Joyce Moore Turner and James Couch led efforts to assure consumer participation in healthcare policy development. Some nonprofits were especially active. The Family Service Association, serving Nassau County, the Family Service League in Suffolk, and Catholic Charities dramatically expanded their programs and led efforts to advocate for greater sensitivity to the needs of the poor, as well as address the many unmet needs of the growing population. We're talking about a population that grew. Suffolk County was 256,000 people in 1945, and Nassau was about double that. And now there are 3 million people, almost 3 million people on Long Island. So hordes of people, you know, and not all of them were making much money. The Health and Welfare Council in Nassau and the Suffolk Community Council played important coordination, informational, and advocacy functions and often spearheaded new initiatives. Other larger organizations played important roles. The Suffolk County Girl Scout Council dramatically expanded its minority recruitment efforts, while the YMCA created an outreach services division, and Cooperative Extension in Suffolk established new outreach programs. In addition, many smaller community-based organizations, especially in low-income communities, were established, funded by county youth bureaus, drug control authorities, and state grants. Small grants, They reached out to at-risk youth and minority group members and built community support. Meanwhile, as women entered the workforce in large numbers, the needs for childcare emerged, promoted by women, principally by women on public assistance and the 2 childcare councils. They advocated for county and state funding to expand childcare service and after-school programs. Disabilities advocates successfully fought to establish a wide variety of community-based programs and services under the auspices of AHRC, UCP, ACLD, IGHL, Federation of Organizations, Clubhouse, and the mental health associations in both counties. Organizational leaders became more sophisticated in seeing the connections between their work with individuals and the systems impinging on their constituents' lives. They cultivated and established relationships with elected and appointed officials as well as with the media. And alliances and networks were built that generated new individual, foundation, and corporate support for direct service programs. My research identified 40 trailblazing public policies and social welfare programs established during the 1960 to 1985 period. They were first launched on Long Island and later replicated elsewhere in the nation. Here's a few examples. In the mid-1960s, the banning of DDT in the U.S. began when Carol Yanacone of Patchogue saw dead fish in a Yapak pond and brought together her husband, attorney Vincent Yanacone, and scientists from Brookhaven National Laboratories and Stony Brook University to investigate. They filed and won a lawsuit against the Suffolk Mosquito Control Commission seeking to bar DDT. The assembled group, over time, became the Environmental Defense Fund. In 1966, Nassau-Suffolk Law Services was the first legal service corporation established in New York State. In 1970, the Ministries in the Marketplace, later to be named the Smith Haven Ministries and later to be named the Ministries, became the first ecumenical ministry located in a shopping mall. All of those unwashed and unwanted at-risk kids, all interfering with shopping. In 1973, New York State's Central Child Abuse Registry came into being due to efforts launched by Suffolk residents who joined State Assemblyman Peter Costigan from Port Jefferson, who sponsored the enabling legislation. Also in 1973, Group House of Port Washington filed a lawsuit against the town of North Hempstead to open a group home for homeless boys unrelated by blood to live in a home designed as a one-family residence. The case was won in New York State's Court of Appeals and is being used around the nation to benefit other at-risk populations. In 1976, the Victims Information Bureau of Suffolk launched New York State's first emergency motel housing program for battered wives. In 1981, Women on the Job established New York State's first regional women's equal employment rights agency to organize women employed in school districts and counties to use collective bargaining rights for pay equity and sexual harassment prevention policies. And, far from least, in 1983, Suffolk County, New York State, and grassroots citizens groups stopped the Shoreham nuclear power plant from going into commercial operation, the first time a completed nuclear power plant was stopped in the U.S. from going into commercial operation, despite powerful banking, publishing, and utility interests. Thus, Long Island was a hotbed of social innovation in the 60s and 70s, challenging the notion of Long Island as a conservative backwater that many Long Islanders wanted to fight, and confirming that many Long Islanders wanted to fight for social welfare programs and social justice. The substantial work completed during the past 70 years is responsible for today's social infrastructure and the political support to sustain it. The leaders served in many roles: advocates, educators, mediators, facilitators, community organizers, often working, before our president became a community organizer, we were doing community organizing, often working behind the scenes to effect change. They work closely with elected officials. And just as an aside, some of the elected officials in Suffolk County came to the legislature because of their opposition to the Shoreham nuclear power plant. And they only acquired the consciousness about social issues, once in office. And then we had folks like Steve Engelbright and Nora Bredis and others, and Millie Steinberg, and a range of people. Many of them, this was a hotbed. Perhaps no surprise with a university here, but Northwest Brookhaven Township had its share of activists. They understood that social change takes time and requires a healthy respect for process. The activists accomplished much despite being labeled by a former Vice President of the United States as nabobs of negativism, socialists, and social engineers. They focused their organization's attention on identifying practical solutions to societal ills. The activists increasingly appreciated the influence of political party affiliation, but resisted temptations to have their organizations become identified as favoring one party over another. Buy those tickets and, those contracts will come, was what was said. They accomplished what they did while the African American community was suspicious, often, of white social workers, teachers, and the police, often seeing them as the agents of the status quo and insensitive to the needs of African Americans. Social welfare workers came from different education and training orientations, ranging from psychotherapeutic interventions, group work, and community organization. In the 50s and 60s, schools of social work saw individual casework as the major method of social work practice, while group work had begun to be taught as well. Group workers, with their affinity towards collective thinking, were responsive to a curriculum that included a broader view of social work practice, a more generic one that contributed to the alleviation of poverty, inequality, and health and mental health disparities. Ultimately, a more balanced curriculum was adopted by schools of social work, an important development. Social work education's particular interest in community organization began in the late 1960s, evolving primarily from changes in the external environment, particularly the war on poverty and the civil rights movement. By the 1970s, schools of social work began to expand their field work sites to include non-traditional settings such as legislators' offices, the Health and Welfare Council, the Suffolk Community Council, the Peconic Community Council, as well as the action coalitions that focused on welfare reform and supplemental security insurance. While social welfare has evolved over the years to address social ills, I believe there's one area particularly that needs greater attention. This is my personal opinion, not that of the collection of people I interviewed, but it was implied that the scarcity of social welfare workers and others in the helping professions don't seek political office. At the national level, social welfare workers have made inroads in this area. 2 U.S. senators and 7 congressmen currently in office. My research revealed that there were 3 examples, 2 from the same family, graduates of the School of Social Welfare, I believe, and an assemblywoman in Nassau County. That was it. And I might add, as an aside, Andy Kazaza, a graduate social worker, ran against Assemblyman Bob Wirtz in the 70s and almost beat him in a heavily Republican Smithtown Township. But that's it. You know, social workers don't seem to take that step towards formal political activity. The development of the Health Science Center at Stony Brook University under the leadership of Dr. Edmund Pellegrino was a major development in Long Island's social welfare scene. Under Pellegrino's leadership, patient accessibility and patient care were emphasized. Well before the rise of managed care, Pellegrino was dissatisfied with the direction medicine was taking, turning healthcare into a commodity, a business. The Health Science Center is a monument to the dream of Dr. Pellegrino. Of particular note was Dr. Pellegrino's appointment of Sanford Sandy Kravitz as founding dean of the School of Social Welfare. Kravitz was the former deputy director of the Federal Office of Economic Opportunity, OEO, in the administration of President Lyndon Baines Johnson. Kravitz brought the spirit and social activism of the war on poverty to the school and recruited others who shared his orientation, including the recruitment of African-American students who had served as community organizers during the civil rights battles in Mississippi during the 1960s. The School of Social Welfare, in its very name, signaled to the wider world that its vision, mission, goals, objectives, strategies, and tactics would be much broader than that of traditional social work that focused on the development of therapeutic coping mechanisms designed to improve the emotional and psychological well-being of individuals, families, and small groups. The school's philosophy met with considerable resistance from both politicians and social work practitioners. Many of them expressed strong opposition to the school's approach, with concerns that the fieldwork students that their agencies relied on to provide treatment to their clients might not be adequately trained. They were also concerned that the fieldwork students might be unwilling to accept agency policies and practices and thus be more hindrances than helpers. Despite I see some head shake of affirmative. Despite these early concerns, the School of Social Welfare has had a profound influence on Long Island social welfare services, with many of its graduates assuming leadership positions in public and private agencies. The school's focus on social justice and its mission of empowerment of the disenfranchised and vulnerable have created many opportunities of low-income people to earn higher educations and move into the helping professions. The school's Sayville project, providing community services to former patients in state mental hospitals and their families, is a perfect example of the school's focus. Things have changed a great deal in the past 30 years for Long Island social welfare organizations. On the positive side, social work education on Long Island has dramatically expanded, with programs now at C.W. Post, Molloy College, and St. Joseph's College. New funding opportunities were created by several foundations that began to provide financial support to nonprofits, particularly the Hagedorn Foundation, the Roush Foundation, the Sandy River Charitable Foundation, and the Women's Fund. The United Way expanded its grant program, as did the Long Island Community Foundation. And I'm told there's been an uptick in some corporate giving programs. In addition, important support services were created at Adelphi, the Long Island Center for Nonprofit Leadership that Dick Dina was instrumental in creating, and the Association for Fundraising Professionals. And importantly, the Long Island Volunteer Center dramatically expanded its recruitment of needed volunteers to meet the growing demand. Regarding service delivery to new constituents, there's been significant growth among organizations serving people with disabilities, the hungry and homeless, veterans, and new immigrants. Another positive improvement in the social welfare scene is the dramatic expansion of consumer participation on governmental commissions and task forces, as well as membership on nonprofit boards of directors. Another personal note. Note is especially made of the valuable roles played by the Long Island Progressive Coalition, serving as a consumer advocate on many important social welfare and social justice issues and economic and community, social welfare and social justice issues, and recognition of the economic and community development work of Vision Long Island, Sustainable Long Island, and the Sustainable Institute at Malloy College. Meanwhile, the past 30 years have seen a significant increase of regulatory and reporting requirements for nonprofit organizations. IRS and state regulations and statutes have come at a price, causing nonprofits to continually face the same conundrum, that is, complying with ever-increasing laws and provisions while keeping administrative expenditures to a minimum. In addition, nonprofit organizations today face many financial challenges resulting from growing competition from for-profit organizations, shifting governmental policies, and changing policies by cost-conscious third-party purchases such as Medicare, Medicaid, and private health insurers. Nonprofits under contract with managed care companies have had to acquire the skills to analyze and present data to enable informed clinical and administrative decisions and establish new systems of data collection and metrics. Earlier, there were public and private funders that had awarded startup grants and feasibility studies grants to address unmet needs and challenge unjust governmental policies and procedures. There are few such grants available today. Today, nonprofits are increasingly expected to conduct fundraising drives and secure charitable contributions. However, many nonprofits don't have the skills or time needed to undertake these efforts, or don't have people of means on their boards of directors to raise the needed funds. These organizations face very uncertain futures. These issues have caused many agencies created in the 60s and 70s to close their doors, while others have consolidated or merged with other organizations. The end result of these conditions is that today's social welfare organizations must concentrate a great deal of their efforts to assure institutional survival, leaving less time for community organizing and social change activities. Fortunately, many of today's leaders have creatively adapted to these changing conditions and remain optimistic that they will continue to be able to do so. There are questions that the people I interviewed raised, and I put them before you. Who will replace Suffolk County's social reformers? I'm sorry, I should not have said Suffolk County. I don't know why I said that. Who will replace Long Island's social reformers of the past? And will they have the sense of purpose and perseverance as leaders of the past did? Who will replace the philanthropic supporters of social reform of the past? Will Long Island's Wall Street tycoons and wealthy baby boomers come forth to support Long Island charities and social reform measures? What will be the impact of growing business corporate membership on nonprofit boards? Many nonprofits have brought in expertise from corporate Long Island. Sometimes that has strings. To what extent will social work education continue its long-standing tradition of social reform? The people interviewed made suggestions for today's leaders. They continue to believe that small groups of passionate people can still accomplish a great deal with perseverance, intelligence, and creativity. They feel strongly that government needs to be the primary funding source of social services, with private charity playing a supportive secondary role. In this regard, many interviews express concern about managed care and how it will impact service providers. They believe that appeals for support based on values are often more effective than those based on facts and figures. They urge future leaders to take greater steps to educate elected officials, particularly during this period of relative economic stability, don't quote me on that, by treating them respectfully and assessing where they're coming from. They see today's continued racism as a major indicator that there's still much to be done. And they view civil disobedience as a valuable strategy to influence public policy. Some urge academic institutions to do more to prepare students with foundational studies about social work history, community social work, administrative and business leadership skills, and policy development. They believe that training should also include fundraising and community organizational skills to work with socially and economically diverse populations. They see the biggest social service gaps as affordable housing, heroin addiction, and mental health. Speaking personally, I'd add youth and aging services to the list. Interviewees recommend that advocates present themselves to politicians with open minds, not stereotyping or prejudging elected officials on their party affiliations or positions on other issues. They believe that elected officials need to be convinced that suburban poverty is a greater problem than they may have imagined, a problem that requires that they do something they've been unwilling to do, raise taxes for new investments in education, mental health, and community-based youth and family services. They suggest that nonprofits recruit board members with political acumen that are passionate about their organization's mission and willing to be advocates in behalf of the organization's constituency. They encourage nonprofit leaders not to simply follow the money, but concentrate on what they do best. And they feel that it's important to engage people of color and new immigrants in order to tap their understanding of local needs. Many interviewees express concern about today's emphasis on measurable health and mental health outcomes, feeling that this emphasis can overlook important, less quantifiable measurements, such as the degree of community cohesiveness and support that's generated, quality of life issues, providing positive role models, the emergence of leadership in a community. Regarding the issue of affordable housing, Jim Morgo, a former Chief Deputy County Executive and President of Long Island Housing Partnership, urges expanded efforts to revitalize communities outside of government through civic community alliances. Richard Kubek of the Huntington Housing Coalition suggests a greater focus on mobilizing the faith community that has been on the forefront for many years of charitable works. And some interviewees suggest that impact investing warrants the attention of nonprofit funders. Impact investing refers to investment in companies, organizations, and funds with the intention of generating measurable, beneficial social or environmental impacts rather than profit. It's a form of socially responsible investing that serves as a guide for various investment strategies. Long Island foundations are likely to have billions of dollars in endowments, some of which could be directed into impact investments. Other interviewees feel that nonprofits should also consider the establishment of revenue-generating social enterprises to help them expand their income through the sales of goods and services. A growing number have successfully done so in other parts of the country, but very few on Long Island. Many interviewees urge nonprofit boards to identify board members that bring financial expertise to their organizations, and particularly wealthy donors. Charitable giving from wealthy donors is seen is a major challenge for the sector. Not to replace the foundation in government for basic social services, but it's seen as very important. History suggests that changing public attitudes and reforming suburban institutions are incremental, often taking decades to accomplish, and are filled with challenges, disappointments, and struggles. Suburbs like Long Island were shaped due to the need of affordable housing, and which is an essential element of democratic society. Otherwise, Long Island will move further towards being a vast sprawl of exclusionary living and social disintegration conditions. Social welfare leaders, with their understanding of human dynamics, group process, and systems theory, can play a vital role in influencing positive change. Reformers should continue to stir the pot with facts, concerns, challenges, and questions. The body of social welfare and social action knowledge that has been accumulated by our forebears is as relevant today as it was years ago. We need to remain optimistic about the future, seeing the cyclical nature of social change. We need to build on the many achievements of the past by assembling our facts and function as articulate, passionate salespeople to policymakers and the media. Regarding this subject of optimism, Dr. Brisbane speaks with enthusiasm about young people's views towards social change and social justice. She points to the schools of social work across the nation where she's visited. And she reports that many of the children here at the School of Social Welfare in the early years are currently following the paths of their parents who went to the school back in the 70s. She points to young people's activism in the Occupy Wall Street movement and the heavy participation of white young people in Ferguson, Missouri, and the other cities that recently experienced the shooting of unarmed black people. She feels that today's youth just won't take the racism that her generation did. She also sees the substantial activism of many faith-based organizations and the NAACP as reasons for optimism. She feels that activists are better prepared and organized today than they were years ago. Robert Detour, former president and CEO of South Oaks Hospital and a leader in the mental health field, is also optimistic about the future of community-based care because the cost of one day in a hospital is the same as 1 month in a community-based apartment. Another call for optimism comes from Renee Feichter, a Nassau County Assistant DA and Director of its Community Affairs. Feichter meets with large numbers of millennial generation members on a regular basis. He reinforces Dr. Brisbane's confidence that young people possess the passion to continue the legacy of social reform and social justice that's described in the book. In closing, I believe that current nonprofit leaders and social activists owe a great deal to those who paved the way. They successfully overcame many of the same challenges facing today's advocates. Their stories are testimony to the resiliency, creativity, industriousness, and the generosity that exists on Long Island. It should inspire everyone to move forward with optimism to build upon the groundwork laid in the past. They did what they could do to make the world a better place for future generations. And in the end, that's the best each of us can do. The opportunity to have known and associated with these people is a gift I'm deeply grateful for. It's been a wonderful ride that I'd gladly do over again. Thank you.